All right, welcome back to Alabama Gristmill. Welcome my co-host, Donna Causey.
Hello.
I jumped on it quick there. Surprised you, didn't I?
Yeah, that was quick.
But it's good to be back. As always, appreciate our listeners. We've got another good story for you today, the history of the town of Georgiana. And the history involved with that. There's a lot tied in with that small town. I guess I'm familiar with the town because it's a stop off on the way to Florida for me.
It's a nice, pretty little town, but it's famous too.
Down in southern Alabama. I guess it's be the southwestern part of Alabama if you're going to put it anywhere, I guess.
Right, and it's famous for one of its citizens. So a lot of people have heard of this fella.
I've seen the billboard going into town there. And this fellow is named
Hank Williams Sr. And I don't think there's a place on the planet Earth that hasn't heard of him. Alabama's very proud of him. You know, even though he didn't live very long, he really had a strong influence on country music. And he's having a birthday on September 17th.
Before we get into the story, just want to say again, thank you to all the listeners out there and also our patrons. They're just really getting a great response there. So if you want to help support the podcast, help support AlabamaPioneers.com and just the general just study of history and sharing the history of Alabama through all these different means, please consider becoming a patron and helping us out. We're small operation here, and anything helps. Anything you can do helps us out. Well, we'll go ahead and get into the story now, and we'll talk a little bit about the town of Georgiana and the history behind it.
Yeah, it might be a few little things you don't know about Georgiana. It's another old town in Alabama. It's located in Butler County in the southern part of the state. It was first settled about in 1824, so not too long after Alabama became a state in 1819, it was settled by the Europeans. Of course, the Native Americans were there. You know, I tend to, when I say settled, it's by the Caucasians and the white Europeans, you know, that settled in the area. It was first settled by John Shepherd. There were a few more pioneers that followed him into the area, but it really didn't grow a whole lot until the L&N Railroad constructed a rail line, and they named it Pittsfield, that little area, our Pitt Station at the time. When the railroad came in, a minister followed, a Baptist minister named Reverend Pitt S. Milner, and he came from Pike County, Georgia. And he settled in what later became known as the Old Milner Place. More pioneers came in and followed him, and a post office was established in about 1855. The town kind of got the name Pittsfield after Pitt Station, and it was called that for a long period of time. And when the post office came in and all, Reverend Miller didn't really like the name Pittsfield, so he renamed it, and he called it Georgiana. And it's named after Georgia, the state he came from, and Anna, his daughter. So his daughter's got some recognition in that name of Georgiana. Other early settlers, and you might run across some of those names if you go visit the area, is Peter Mason, Michael O'Brien. You can see if there's any O'Briens, Dr. Clements, John R. King, T.H. Powell, Miles and Peter Simpson, John W. Wheeler, and the Stockton family were instrumental in settling the area. Many of them opened up their businesses and stores, and it started to grow around 1858 with additional stores and all. And roads and streets started to get cut, and the first school building was opened in a log building, and with only one teacher, Miss Eunice Eskew. Later on, the school really began to grow, and they needed more space. So in 1868, a large building was erected, and it was called the Georgiana Academy. Reverend Pitt Milner started the Baptist Church, and shortly after that, in 1865, the Methodist Church was established in the area. So they really began to grow at that point. And more merchants set up stock and had gins and cotton gins and different things. And in 1869, it quickly grew and became a town and was incorporated as a town. In 1866, mercantile businesses grew, and the town was incorporated in 1869. It grew and became a bigger town, and it was incorporated as a city in 1872, so it had a big growth spurt from 1866 to 1872. And it continued to grow because it was being on the railroad line. It kind of helped out a lot because that would be an area where people would stop off. So they had, by 1885, there were 10 stores, 2 drug shops, 2 hotels, a livery, a feed stable, a warehouse, and the city hall was used for public meetings. They even had theatrical troops that came into town. I guess they came in through the rail lines. So it was really a growing place. Well, it was into this world on September 17, 1923, Hiram Hank Williams Sr. was born. He wasn't known as Hank at that time. He was known as Hiram Williams. He was born in Mount Olive on a farm southeast of Georgiana. But he lived in Georgiana at that time from the ages of 7 to 11. He lived in downtown. And a little side note, local youths like to hang out around the Dr. Pepper bottling plant, which had just been recently built in town, because they could get some of the taste of the pure sugar that came off from the vats. The first 15 to 20 mixtures were too sweet, and they usually let youngsters drink. And I imagine Hank Williams was one of them that hung around there because it was very close to his house where he lived. The mixing was done by hand, and it was said that they ran the bottles under the light to see if there was anything floating inside before they could sell them. So you used to talk about purity, just running under a light. A little bit different than today. Dr. Pepper's is the world's oldest major soft drink maker in the United States. And the plant operated from the 1920s through 1954 on Miranda Street in Georgiana. It's located next to the Georgiana post office. They bottled Orange Crush, Lemon Lime Cola, and Barks Root Beer. And since Hank Williams was more than 500 feet, his home was not more than 500 feet from where the plant was built, I'm sure he was one of the ones who hung around and tried to get some of that sweet sugar. He was known to have shined shoes at the shoe shop and sold peanuts at the train depot. That Dr. Pepper building, by the way, is on the Alabama Register of Landmarks. So I don't know how much has been restored, but it'd be a nice thing to go see if you ever go down into that area. Well, going back to Hank Williams Sr. a little bit, his mother bought him a guitar for $3.50 when he was about 8 years old, and he tried to learn how to play it, and he found a man called Rufus Payne, who was an African-American blues street musician, also known as T-Top Payne. And actually, that was what they called him. They didn't call him Rufus Payne. They called him T-Top. That was a pun for teetotalers. It said that Payne received his nickname because he usually carried a homemade mixture of alcohol and tea wherever he went. He was the one that connected with Hank Williams Sr., and he started teaching him some chords and teaching him how to play. Payne was actually born on Payne Plantation in Sandy Ridge in Lowndes County, Alabama. And he had a big influence on Williams' music style. He also had an influence, evidently, on Roy Acuff and Ernest Tubb. T-Tot and Hank would play the guitar on the front porch during the winter, and during the winter months, they'd crawl underneath the house to play and sing because they get a little warmth of the fireplace that way. And after school, Hank sold the peanuts and shined shoes to help support the family because his dad was very ill and wasn't away. And he sang on the streets for tips, so he was very poor. His mother was pretty much taking care of the household. She had to rent a boarding house. Hank loved going to cowboy movies as a Georgiana picture show. He decided he liked their style so much that he started dressing like a cowboy. He enjoyed that a good bit. Well, his family was always moving on, it seemed like, and he moved to Greenville in 1934, and then they moved on to Montgomery in 1936. And that's when he started calling himself Hank, and it was mainly due to the cowboy shows he would watch, because he didn't think Hiram was a very cowboy-sounding name. So he decided he'd just change it and get called another name. And his music career kind of took off in 1937 when radio station WSFA hired him to perform with his band, the Drifting Cowboys, which he had formed by that time. But he began to have trouble with alcohol abuse, and World War II came along and took away some of the band members, and so the contract with WSFA was terminated. That was one of the early radio stations in Alabama. Back then in Georgiana, The I'll spell it for you so it makes sense. Georgiana Theater is GA-ANA Theater. It was opened on January 31st, 1939. And 8 months later, here's 16-year-old Hank Williams Sr. performed with his Drifting Cowboys at that theater. That's another thing you might want to see and enjoy looking at if you go down to Georgiana and visit it. But Hank's trouble with alcohol abuse and all this kept on going. He kept having troubles with jobs in that respect. But finally, he married Audrey Shepard, and she started managing his career. And that's when it led to a contract with MGM. And, of course, the rest is history about his life. But sadly, he never overcame alcoholism, and he suffered from severe back pain because when he was born, he was born with spina bifida occulta. It's a birth defect on his spinal column, and it gave him a lifelong history of pain. So he would get prescribed prescriptions to ease the pain, but he'd abuse it along with alcohol. And taking all that medicine and prescription medicine and abusing it and all, it made him it compromised his health. In 1952, after he divorced Shepard, he was dismissed by the Grand Ole Opry because of his unreliability and alcohol abuse. And, of course, we all know that on the evening between December 31st, 1952 and early morning January 1st, 1953, he suddenly died while traveling to a concert in Canton, Ohio, at the very young age of 29. Despite his total life, he was one of the most celebrated and influential musicians of the 20th century, especially in regard to country music.
That's a pretty big bit of history with Georgiana, between the Dr. Pepper bottling plant, the growth of the town, and then it being a hometown of Hank Williams Sr. That's a lot for a small town that's in Alabama. Now, does anybody have any videos or anything of the different old houses? I thought you had something along that lines.
Yeah, I have a story about Georgiana and Hank Williams Sr. on the website, and there's a link to Mildred Stinson Brown's YouTube video. She has photographed a lot of the old houses in the area of Georgiana, so you can see what it's like today. If you can't make it down there and you live far away, you can at least get an idea of what it's like down there now. Still a small town, very nice though, and a lot of history.
And if you're coming from northern Alabama, Birmingham, you can always, when you're driving through on a shortcut, I guess the Florida shortcut that I call it, you can stop off and see those different sites and see the little bit of history there of Georgiana, and especially with his birthday coming up next week or this week on September 17th.
That's right. And if you go to Montgomery, you can also go to the museum. They have a museum in Montgomery, Hank Williams Sr. Museum, next to many of the hotels and right downtown Montgomery. And they have all kind of memorabilia from him. And you can also visit the Hank Williams Museum in Georgiana as well. So you could have a full day there.
Yeah, we'll put all those links and everything on the website to show you where they are and the directions and all that, and in the podcast notes here. So, but we just want to kind of give you a quick little look at just kind of highlight Georgiana, Alabama this week on the podcast, and we'll continue to have more stories coming up. Please feel free to share, let friends know about the podcast. We like growing it, and we'd love hearing from our listeners.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something, too, about this story just a second. The Dr. Pepper plant, they're trying to, I think it's in private ownership, but he's trying to restore it, I believe. I'd like to know a little bit more about it. I've tried to do some research, but I don't know a whole lot. If you have special memories of it, please share it.
Please share it out to us. And if you know anything about the restoration, let us know as well. And then we can update this podcast and or post it online as well.
Right, exactly.
Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this episode up in honor of Hank Williams on his birthday. We'll play us out with a little Hank Williams music, and we'll see you next time.
Yes, and have a good day, a good week.
All right, we'll see y'all later.
Bye-bye.
Ain't no more looking. I know I've been cooking, so how about keeping steady company? I'm gonna jump my big book over the fence and buy me one for 5 or 10 cents. I'll keep it till it's covered with